On April 4, 1949, 12 nations signed a pact that is still reshaping global power today. This was not random. It was a chain reaction. How did decisions made in Cold War boardrooms lock in today's rivals, economic systems, and military standoffs? Most people assume the world changed when the Soviet Union fell, but the turning point happened earlier, and it still shapes every global crisis. By the end, you will understand exactly how the Cold War built the world order you live in now. In March 1947, President Harry Truman told Congress the United States would support free peoples resisting subjugation anywhere in the world. This wasn't random. It was a chain reaction. How did that promise turn recovery aid into a strategic weapon, and what did that weapon do to the map of power? Stay tuned. The real turning point shows up in Act 3, midway through this video. By the end, you will understand how Cold War choices built the institutions and rivalries that still shape global politics today. The Truman Doctrine, followed quickly by the Marshall Plan, turned economic recovery into a tool against communist expansion. Billions of dollars flowed into Western Europe, knitting together economies that had once been rivals. Quick recap. Aid bought stability, and stability became influence. The Soviet Union responded by tightening control across Eastern Europe, drawing the line Winston Churchill called the Iron Curtain. Western leaders saw more than military danger. They saw the need for civilian stability. In 1951, 6 nations signed the European Coal and Steel Community Treaty, pooling key industries so future wars would be not just unthinkable, but materially impossible. That economic alliance created incentives to cooperate across borders. Decades later, the Maastricht Treaty in 1993 formalized the European Union, binding countries with a single market and a shared currency. The world divided fast after World War II, not just by tanks and borders, but by competing visions of prosperity and legitimacy. The logic was clear. Economic interdependence could lock in peace, and at the same time it made political blocs self-reinforcing. Institutions born in the scramble for security and recovery still shape how nations cooperate or clash today. Quick contrast. Military blocs build deterrence. Economic blocs build resilience. The civilian side of the Cold War, built on treaties and trade, set the stage for the military alliances and nuclear strategies that would dominate strategy next. Next, we trace how those civilian choices fed directly into permanent alliances and escalating deterrence. Military alliances hardened the lines of the Cold War. On April 4, 1949, 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington, D.C., creating NATO, a pact built on the principle of collective defense. An attack on one would be met by all. This was not just a statement of solidarity. It was a calculated move to deter Soviet aggression and reassure Western Europe that the United States would not retreat across the Atlantic. 6 years later, the Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies responded with the Warsaw Pact, formalized in May 1955. The world was now split by 2 armed camps, each promising to defend its members by force if necessary. Quick recap. Alliances turned political rivalry into institutional reality. But the real ceiling on conflict came from a new kind of weapon. The United States' atomic monopoly ended in 1949 when the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. By the early 1960s, both sides had built up arsenals with thousands of warheads and delivery systems across air, land, and sea, forming the nuclear triad. This structure meant that any first strike would be met with overwhelming retaliation, a logic called mutually assured destruction, MAD. Strategic planners on both sides assumed that even a single miscalculation could trigger a chain reaction no one could control. Alliances and nuclear doctrine worked together. Article 5 of NATO and the Warsaw Pact Mutual Defense Clause locked rivalries in place, but the presence of nuclear weapons made direct war between superpowers unthinkable. Instead, the Cold War became a contest of brinkmanship and indirect pressure, with the threat of annihilation always in the background. Next, we will examine how that balance pushed rivalry into proxy wars, and how those indirect fights still shape regional conflicts today. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved and the Warsaw Pact faded into history. Yet NATO, the alliance built to contain Soviet power, did not disband. This was a deliberate choice by leaders from Washington to Brussels. They decided that NATO would survive and even expand. Quick question, why did they keep it? The answer is cause and consequence. Policymakers feared a security vacuum. They chose continuity, and that decision changed the map. Quick recap. The North Atlantic Cooperation Council, launched in 1991, opened dialogue with former adversaries, but the core alliance stayed intact. On May 27, 1997, the NATO-Russia Founding Act formalized the new arrangement. The act pledged that NATO and Russia would not see each other as enemies, and it promised no permanent stationing of substantial combat forces in new member states. The document was signed by Russian President Boris Yeltsin, but Russian officials warned that dividing lines were being redrawn farther east, and they voiced fears of encirclement. In March 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO, the first former Warsaw Pact countries to do so. Alliance leaders welcomed new members with public ceremonies and private assurances of support. In Moscow, expansion sparked protests and warnings about strategy and security. An expert at the time summed up the dilemma: NATO's survival stabilized Central Europe, but it also guaranteed that rivalry would outlast the Cold War itself. The consequence was clear. NATO had not just weathered the end of its original adversary, it had found new purpose, turning a post-Cold War moment into a longer era of competition. Micro-open loop. The next section traces how that expansion pushed rivalry into politics, economics, and technology, with consequences that few planners fully expected. Battles fought in distant jungles and mountain passes often began with decisions in Washington and Moscow. In Korea in 1950, North Korean troops surged across the 38th parallel, backed by Soviet weapons and Chinese soldiers. The United States and its allies responded with airstrikes and ground forces under a United Nations banner. 3 years later, the shooting stopped, but the peninsula remained divided, an armistice line, not a peace treaty, sealing in a standoff that persists to this day. Vietnam followed a similar script. In the 1960s, American bombers and helicopters struck the Ho Chi Minh Trail, while the Soviet Union and China supplied North Vietnamese forces with weapons and advisors. The U.S. withdrew in 1973, and in 1975, Saigon fell. The war left deep scars across Southeast Asia. Quick recap. Capitals chose allies. Allies received weapons and advisors, and local wars became arenas for great power competition. Afghanistan became the Soviets' Vietnam. In 1979, Soviet tanks rolled in to prop up a friendly government. The CIA funneled Stinger missiles and cash to the Mujahideen through Pakistan. After a decade of grinding conflict, the Soviets pulled out in 1989, leaving behind chaos that would ripple for generations. Some conflicts never truly ended. In Transnistria, a 1992 ceasefire froze Russian-backed forces on the Dniester River. Nagorno-Karabakh erupted in violence in the late 1980s and settled into a tense stalemate. These frozen conflicts are Cold War legacies. Zones where outside powers still hold sway and where peace remains elusive. The cost of rivalry is measured not just in headlines, but in generations living with uncertainty. Decision, consequence, escalation, transformation. Capitals chose partners, outside support prolonged fighting, and regions were left divided. Next, we will trace how those frozen lines reshaped alliances and drew in new competitors. Deng Xiaoping's reforms in 1978 launched China onto a new path. By opening its markets and welcoming foreign investment, China's leaders aimed to harness global trade while keeping political control. Over the next 2 decades, China's gross domestic product grew at rates the world had not seen before. When China joined the World Trade Organization on December 11, 2001, it gained access to markets across the globe and fueled an export boom that reshaped entire industries. Quick recap. Market opening produced rapid growth and deep integration, but economic integration also became a source of leverage. After Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, the The United States and European Union imposed sweeping sanctions, cutting off Russian banks and targeting energy exports. These tools, tariffs, export controls, and blacklists, turned market access into a weapon. Today, Chinese policymakers and Western sanction architects both use economic ties as pressure points, blurring the line between commerce and strategy. Next, we will show how those same economic levers shifted toward technology and supply chains, and how that shift redefined global competition. Spy planes once traced invisible lines across the sky, hunting for secrets in enemy territory. In 1960, a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft was shot down over the Soviet Union, and its pilot was captured and paraded on television. The world learned just how far states would go to pierce each other's defenses. It did not end. It just changed form. Quick recap: from spy planes to digital collection, the tools shifted, but the logic did not. By 2013, Edward Snowden's leaks exposed the scale of digital surveillance. They revealed that intelligence agencies now collect and analyze data on a global scale, often without public oversight. The Cold War also shaped how nations frame their rivals, not just through weapons, but through words: democracy versus authoritarianism, freedom versus control. Those narratives drive suspicion and loyalty, and they fuel mistrust even when the facts are hidden. Decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the habits of secrecy and ideological rivalry continue to shape how leaders and citizens see the world and each other. Next, we will trace how these intelligence habits met the internet, and how that collision still sets the rules of global competition. Global rivalries still echo Cold War logic, with military alliances, sanctions, and deep mistrust shaping every diplomatic move. As nuclear arsenals grow and new powers rise, the logic of deterrence endures. This changes how states make decisions and how crises are managed. The world has not moved on. It is adapting old habits to new realities. The real test is, can we break that cycle?